our members, our supporters, the folks who make sure that we have the means and access to continue doing the work we do. So I just want to say thank you for all that you do for us. I'm Robin Surratt. I'm the Vice President of Lancaster History. I can't think of a better way to kick off this 26th/27th season than with this illustrious panel we have over here. And so without further ado, I'm going to get started by introducing your moderator for the evening, my friend, Lenwood Sloan. I had to really rein in his biography because this man has done almost everything you can imagine. Lenwood Sloan, Lenny, is well known across the U.S. as a catalytic agent, an animator, a facilitator of cultural and heritage programs, and incredibly rich conversations. For the past 40 years, Lenny has provided inspiration, leadership, and technical assistance both in the public and the private sector. Before his official retirement, and I think it's important to say official retirement because he's probably working as much as he did when he was not retired, Lenny served as both the director of Pennsylvania's Cultural and Heritage Tourism Program, as well as filling the role of Pennsylvania's Film Commissioner, in which capacity he directed the $60 million Film Tax Credit Office. His other portfolio includes film initiatives, history productions, collaborative tourism partnerships, television documentaries, widely acclaimed dance programs, artistic credits. Is there anything you haven't done? Origami? For 30 years, Lenny collaborated with the renowned Mick Maloney, presenting programs, concerts, and masterclasses on the convergence, contributions, and conflicts of Black and Irish experiences in the United States. And I know that's a project quite dear to you. Currently, Lenny serves as the executive director of the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Monument Project, spearheading the effort to ensure the creation and preservation of historic and cultural monuments throughout the state of Pennsylvania. In that capacity, he's spearheading the placement of the first monument dedicated to the 15th and 19th Amendments in the United States at Pennsylvania's Capitol. He's also a board member of the African American Irish Diaspora Network, and of truly critical and personal importance to us, he's the co-chair of the steering committee for the Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith Center for History and Democracy. Yeah. Without further ado, Lenwood Sloan.
Have emailed my four sisters Robin's address so that if they need my eulogy done, she already did it. So it's already written. It's a great honor to be in this audience, and I wanted to start because I'm a wordsmith. That with the definition of a colloquium, to deal with a current cutting-edge concern through preparatory study, engagement with community, meetings, dialogues, and actions to form policy. Tonight, we're going to take on a complex conversation in a short period of time about the Underground Railroad as the landscape for discussing the main line of that railroad from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. And I want to say very quickly, in lieu of my slides here, that we're going to talk about one specific aspect of the Underground Railroad because it's in a complex equation, and that is the movement of people through a system known as the railroad and the support structures. But it's only one piece of an equation. The Underground Railroad is kind of like building a house. The foundation of that house, thank you, ma'am. The foundation of that house, the basement, the structure is the freedom seeker himself or herself. The four walls are flight, prompt succor, or food, housing, safety, water. Vigilance and resistance is the third wall, and assimilation and accommodation into citizenship is the fourth wall. So the basement or the foundation is a freedom seeker. Flight is one wall, Prompt succor is one wall. Vigilance and resistance is one wall and deals with communities who fought against the fugitive bounty hunters, and communities that assisted in assimilation and support. So what is the roof? Well, the roof is education, and the spire or the bell is citizenship and enterprise. We're going to talk about that wall which is built, which is called flight, and the role that the railroad played in that flight. My friends are Barbara Zaborowski, Dr. Leroy Hopkins, living legend, living treasure, Randy Harris, the engine of all projects that I have participated in, and John Sigmund, who is bringing people back to the invisible Underground Railroad. There are 3 books that I would like you to look at in the lobby here. The first and the second are written by the same man. His name is Cooper Wingard. Cooper Wingard is right now at George Washington University. He has 2 books out there, The Underground Railroad in South Central Pennsylvania and The Abolitionist Movement in South Central Pennsylvania. And I draw you to those 2 books because I want you to, I'm using my 5 minutes of this since the slides didn't come. I draw you to those 2 books because it differentiates the role of the abolitionist movement from the task and the responsibilities of the Underground Railroad. And sometimes we think of those things as synonymous, and sometimes the players were in both camps. The third book is called The Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania, and it is full of maps and routes that we travel along 11 and 15 and 30 and 422 and 222 that were really important groundings. We started this story in 2005 with Pennsylvania and identifying Underground Railroad sites that were vetted and approved by at least 3 sources and were identified to become part of the national movement called the Network to Freedom. Pennsylvania chose the title Quest for Freedom because we believe that in that building, the Underground Railroad and flight was only one wall, but citizenship and freedom required other parts and structures. We began to look across the state, and we're very happy that in 2005, there were 19 official sites in Pennsylvania that were vetted sites. We now have over 60, Randy? Over 60 sites. And so our goal is to connect the dots so that you can see a constellation of partnership at a time where the dots were not supposed to be connected. And my colleagues will tell you about that in a little more. Of course, Pennsylvania in general, Pennsylvania is an 8-hour drive away from 51% of the population of the United States. And certainly Pennsylvania, sitting just above the Mason-Dixon line, was a junction, not a destination, but a junction. It had been a destination until 1850, as our colleagues will tell you. But after the Fugitive Slave Act, people had to move beyond Pennsylvania. So it's important to ask ourselves 3 questions as we listen to my colleagues. The first is, where were people coming from? The second was, how long did they need to stay with us? And the third was, where were they going next? And who did we know that could help them? That was the question that was asked by first 19 and now 60 sites as we move towards a statewide coalition effort. This is a map of other organizations that are trying to interpret Pennsylvania and its cultural and heritage history. Our tourism office, our Department of Agriculture, our Department of Transportation are all part of the preservation, restoration, and contextualization of sites. And each site from 2005 until present created a map and a fold-out brochure that talked about their lap in the relay towards the quest for freedom and the major players in their lap. And so with that, I bring you to my colleague, Barbara. We just came out of the hills of Indiana in Blairsville together last weekend, talking to people who thought that as long as they made it to the mountains, they were safe. And so Barbara brings us a very, very interesting story. She wears many hats, and I'd love you to bring her to the.
Okay, so I'm going to take you on a trip along the main line. So it gives me great pleasure tonight to take you on that trip. I hope you enjoy our journey. So why the main line of public works? Well, we begin our journey with why the state of Pennsylvania constructed the main line of public works to begin with. The answer is simple. It was a matter of economics. To the north of Pennsylvania in New York State, the Erie Canal opened in 1825, allowing for commerce and passengers to get from the Hudson River near Albany to Lake Erie in Buffalo. Similarly, to our south in Maryland, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal construction began in 1828 and offered a similar experience of getting from Washington, D.C. to Cumberland, Maryland. Pennsylvania started to see both passengers and freight bypassing the state for these more convenient forms of travel. To cross the state of Pennsylvania in the 1820s and 30s took about 12 days to get from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh by wagon. The state determined that if it had a similar transportation system like New York and Maryland, it could cut travel time to just 3 days. So in 1826, the Pennsylvania legislature passed the main line of public works. That began the exploration into a statewide system of transportation. For those of you familiar with Pennsylvania and the concept of a canal system, you have to take a look at the geography of Pennsylvania and ask yourself, what do we do with those pesky Allegheny Mountains that run through the center of the state? Well, we'll get to that in a minute, but I'd also like you to consider those mountains and how people traveled north to south through the state. That will become very important when we talk about freedom seekers and the work of the Underground Railroad. But now, back to the main line. Engineers working on the main line project came up with a clever solution to the problem of the mountains in the center of the state. They designed a system that consisted of 3 methods of transportation, namely a traditional railroad, a system of canals, and to conquer those mountains, the Allegheny Portage Railroad. The main line ultimately consisted of 4 divisions: the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, which covered 82 miles, the Columbia to Juniata River Division, which covered 172 miles, the Juniata to Johnstown Division, which covered 26 miles and which consisted primarily of the Allegheny Portage Railroad, and the Johnstown to Pittsburgh Division, which took the last 104 miles. This system covered 384 miles, which enabled travelers to indeed cross the state in 3 days. When the main line opened in 1834, it was not the only means of transportation at work in the Commonwealth. At this time, another form of transportation was active in the form of the Underground Railroad. Since March 1st, 1780, when Pennsylvania passed the Gradual Abolition of Slavery Act, freedom seekers from the border states of Virginia and Maryland were seeking refuge in Pennsylvania. Remember our discussion about Pennsylvania geography and traveling north and south? This is what becomes important as we further explore how the Underground Railroad used geography to assist freedom seekers. So let's begin our trip on the main line, beginning in Philadelphia. Here we meet abolitionist William Still. William was born in New Jersey in 1821 to former slaves. He moved to Philadelphia in 1844 and was active with the Pennsylvania Society for the Abolition of Slavery. In addition to assisting freedom seekers, Still also kept detailed journals of all the individuals he assisted. In 1872, he published the book, The Underground Railroad, which chronicles all of those individuals and their experiences. The first part of the main line consists of the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad. This map shows the location of the eastern terminus of the railroad and its relation to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. As we head west on the railroad, this graphic will give you an idea of the landscapes and elevations as we leave Philadelphia. So now we are traveling the 82 miles from Philadelphia to Columbia. Once we reach Columbia, we will come in contact with one of the prominent citizens there, William Whipper. William Whipper is important to us for two reasons. First, he is a wealthy businessman who, with his partner, Stephen Smith, own a vast lumbering business. As a result of his wealth, he is able to use his influence to assist freedom seekers. This letter, in 1871 to William Still, is especially important because it clearly states that once in Columbia, the road forked. Some I sent west by boats to Pittsburgh, and others to you in our cars to Philadelphia. This provides the concrete evidence that the main line of public works was used for the purposes of the Underground Railroad. As we leave Columbia, we will take the canal up the Susquehanna to Harrisburg, where we will find Tanner's Alley. Tanner's Alley was a black neighborhood in Harrisburg and was an active Underground Railroad stop, thanks in part to abolitionists Joseph Bastille and William Jones. This map shows the location of Tanner's Alley in yellow. You will see the blue line, which shows where the canal ran through Harrisburg. You'll also notice a small cluster of buildings just to the right of the yellow block. This is the state capitol. Tanner's Alley no longer exists, but it was once located along present-day State Street. Let us now leave Harrisburg and continue north until we reach the canal bridge at Clark's Ferry. Here is where we will leave the Susquehanna and begin up the Juniata River. We will now continue on the Juniata until we arrive at Hollidaysburg. Upon arriving in Hollidaysburg, we will now transition from the water of the canals to the trains of the Allegheny Portage Railroad. It should be noted that the canal boats used on the main line were not traditional canal boats and were instead sectional canal boats designed for the different methods of transportation used along the main line. Once you got on your canal in Columbia, you never got off the canal boat again until you hit Pittsburgh. Before we leave Hollidaysburg, we should note that this was the site of the 1855 Parsons and Green incident, which involved freedom seeker Green and the nephew of his owner, Jim Parsons. You can ask me more about this incident later. It's pretty interesting. We will now ascend the Allegheny Portage Railroad. In 1842, when Charles Dickens traveled across the state, he described the Portage Railroad as an engineering marvel. It consists of 10 inclined planes, 5 to take you up the mountain from Hollidaysburg and 5 to take you down the mountains into Johnstown. This picture shows the Lemon House at the summit of the railroad. Today, this is part of the Allegheny Portage Railroad National Historic Site. We have now arrived in Johnstown. Here we find a couple of abolitionists who were involved in various activities. The most famous encounter occurs in 1837 and involves William and John Cushion, William Slick, Wallace Fortune, and Henry Willis. They assist two freedom seekers, Patrick and Abraham, who have escaped from Bath, Virginia. The case actually makes it to a Cambria County grand jury who dismisses the charges brought by the bounty hunters. I would also like to point out on this list that Daniel Morrell, president of the Cambria Iron Company, the largest iron manufacturer in the country at this time, regularly holds abolitionist meetings in the brick warehouse of the Cambria Iron Company. From Johnstown, we are now going to walk the 104 miles to Pittsburgh. The first town we come to outside of Johnstown is Blairsville in Indiana County. While there are many abolitionists in Indiana County, currently over 90 have been identified, the one we are going to meet here is John Graff. John is a businessman who does a lot of shipping on the main line. There is a lock located in Blairsville, not far from the home of John Graff. John constructed a tunnel from the top of the Conemaugh River bank through the yard of his brother's 1820 home under South Liberty Street and into the floor of his carriage house. He used this tunnel to get freedom seekers from the canal to the safety of his home. From Blairsville, we make our way into Pittsburgh. The image at the top right shows the canal bridge crossing the Allegheny River to Pittsburgh's north side. You will see on the map the dotted brown line that shows that the canal ended just past the site of present-day PNC Park. When constructing Interstate 279 in 1982, they actually uncovered Lock 4, and that's the picture in the lower right corner. Also of interest, in the 1950s, an underground tunnel was located on the north side that ran from the area of Lock 4 to the Avery Memorial Church. This was discovered during construction of present-day Allegheny Center Mall. The images show the tunnel and the former church. So what makes Pittsburgh so important on both the main line and the Underground Railroad? Well, the number of famous abolitionists who were active in the area. This includes Reverend Charles Avery, who founded the Allegheny Institute and Mission Church, which later became known as Avery College, an educational institution created exclusively for African Americans. The Vashons, John B., his son John Boyer, and his wife Susan. John often purchased the freedom of blacks from their captors. The Pittsburgh Anti-Slavery Society was organized and formed in his home. He ran a barbershop and opened the first public bath in Pittsburgh. Then there's Martin Delany, abolitionist, journalist, creator of the abolitionist newspaper, The Mystery. He was a physician and a military officer. Both he and his wife worked tirelessly to support abolitionist causes, both locally and nationally. Finally, Jane Grace Swisshelm, who while in Pittsburgh started her own weekly abolitionist newspaper, the Pittsburgh Sunday Visitor, and who in 1856 traveled to Crescent, PA to visit with Senator Charles Sumner as he recuperated from his beating by Preston Brooks on the floor of the U.S. Senate. So why is there so much abolitionist and Underground Railroad activity in Pittsburgh? Primarily because in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, Pittsburgh is located just 59 miles from Wheeling, Virginia, which at this time served as a regional hub for the sale of slaves. This is important because a freedom seeker who manages to escape from the slave market and can make it to Pittsburgh can find assistance. Likewise, after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, blacks could be captured in Pittsburgh and sent to Wheeling for sale. So this is the end of our journey on the main line. I hope you enjoyed the trip.
Just very quickly, I'd like to point out a couple of things that Barbara touched upon. The first is when she got to Harrisburg, at Tanner's Alley, you saw a Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission blue and gold sign there that said that Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison spoke on that corner of Tanner's Alley. They were on their way to Pittsburgh to meet Martin Delany, who was in her slide. Mr. Douglass hoped to convince Martin Delany to send 200 blacks to join John Brown in his Harper's Valley raid. Now, it wasn't that Mr. Delany did not wish to support John Brown, but Mr. Delany was a military specialist, and he knew that Harper's Ferry was against a rock cliff, and they would be trapped. The history says that Delany declined John Brown, but he only declined the situation, the position. You've also heard that we are trying, as we elevate ourselves and illuminate ourselves about the history of the Underground Railroad, to also elevate and illuminate the language that we use when we speak. Language is so important. So you will hear us speak of freedom seekers instead of runaways. Completely different perspective on the people. You will hear us speak of self-emancipators rather than fugitives. You will hear us speak of enslaved people, which is a verb, rather than slaves, which is a noun. I can't think of any mother who named her child slave. So enslaving is an action upon a people. Slave as an acceptance. We're working with this language, and you help us by also working, checking. We also ask you to not give up your Chicago school English, but whenever you are using Black as a noun, please capitalize it. If you were speaking about Black as a shade, then it should be a lowercase. The man who has the most eloquent handle on speech in any language is Dr. Leroy Hopkins, who will present next.
Of course, he didn't say anything about technology. I guess I'll do this right.
Yeah, just run on.
Oh yeah, good. Why Columbia? I asked myself that question. I suggest you look at the journal article that came out in 1984, Black El Dorado and the Susquehanna, Emergence of Black Columbia, 1726 to 1869. I wrote that, I hate to think of it, 39 years ago. Why Columbia? What does Columbia have to do with the Underground Railroad? The earliest books on the Underground Railroad, Robert Smedley's The Underground Railroad in Chester and surrounding counties, mentions Columbia as the center place. Also, Wilbur Siebert, whose book on the Underground Railroad, which came out in 1899, also mentions Columbia. Why was this? It goes back, and I guess I can take some time here. The Columbia Abolition Society was organized in 1818. William Wright, the grandson of John Wright, who founded Lancaster County, was president of that Abolition Society, and it is thought that he was the one, or this group was the one, that brought 56 emancipated Africans from Esau Bacon's plantation to Columbia. Freedom Papers of one of those, Mr. Hayden, is here in the collection. And then within a few years, this is 1819, and then between 1820 and 1821, about 100 emancipated Africans from the plantation of Sally Bell came to Columbia, and that was the nucleus of the antebellum of the pre-Civil War Black community in Columbia. At one point, Columbia's Blacks represented 20% of the population. So if you're escaping from enslavement, you would not hide in this audience. You would go someplace where you could find anonymity. These two men were the authors of the history of Chester County. After the Civil War, there were many county histories, and in it, they tell the story about the Underground Railroad, that the name came from the fact that someone who was commissioned to catch a freedom seeker got to the Susquehanna and said, where did they go to? They must have escaped on an underground railway. Smedley copies this story, but actually the person who first mentions it is Samuel Evans. Samuel Evans was one of the founding members of this historical society. He was born near Columbia in 1820, and in the Lancaster newspaper in 1870, an article called Reminiscences of Slavery, he talks about the Underground Railroad, and he's the first person to point out to the importance of Black agency. He mentions only one white person who's involved in the Underground Railroad. All the others are African American. One is there, William Whipper. William Whipper was born in Drumore Township in 1804. We know very little about his early life. We know that he went to Philadelphia, and somehow he got to know Stephen Smith. One story is that he married Stephen Smith's half-sister. That may be true, it may not be true, we don't know. But we do know that in 1841, a partnership was officially created, Smith and Whipper, and they they sold lumber, they sold other things, they transported goods. You see a train car there. They owned 23 train cars. the engine was rented from the state, but they owned the cars. And in that car, they had a hidden spot where a freedom seeker could be secreted. Now, this probably started around 1837. The first train is 1834. And we think that William Whipper is in Columbia in 1838. He shows up on the tax list, which are also here on deposit in 1838. And so they would be sent to Philadelphia. We'll find out more from John, who will talk about where they probably got off the train, because it's not like today you go to the 30th Street station and get off. You want to hide a little.
Can I mention things to our audience?
Sure.
This fabulous drawing was done by Mike Abel.
Oh, yes, Mike Abel. Mike Abel is the editor of our journal. Now let's go into the next one. And there's a picture of William Whipper where his house was. Of course, none of this exists today. Pennsylvania Railroad, through eminent domain, took over this area in the 1880s, and it was leveled. And there's Stephen Smith. Stephen Smith was born in Paxtang, which is today Harrisburg, about 1796. The exact date is not known. In 1801, he was bought. He was an indentured servant. Excuse me. As we talked about the Gradual Abolition Act, what it did was those who were enslaved before 1780 were slaves for life, whereas their children became indentured servants, which, to use a common term, was slavery by another name. They had to serve until they were 28 years of age. The life expectancy at this time was about 30. So, and what happened, they were supposed to be free then, but not only the children, but also the grandchildren of enslaved Africans were made indentured servants, so that in 1830, the state Supreme Court intervened and said this was not the intention of the original law. Well, he was bought by Thomas Bode, who was a lumber merchant. And we found out from one of our programs that we had in Columbia, we have had that, when I say we, the African American Historical Society, together with Mennonite History, sponsored a walking tour for the Underground Railroad in Columbia. We didn't do it this past year. Oh, no, we're not doing it this year, but hopefully next year. And a descendant of the family of Thomas Bode came and said, the story in the family is that Stephen Smith was Thomas Bode's son, which is not surprising when you consider when he was a teenager, he was entrusted with the management of Thomas Bode's lumberyard. He was allowed to keep some of the profits, so that by the time he's 22, he buys his freedom, the lumberyard, and also the freedom of his wife-to-be. And he goes on to become the wealthiest African or free African east of the Mississippi. When he died in 1873 in Philadelphia, he was worth probably $600,000. This past weekend, a group of us went to Cape May, New Jersey. He had a summer house in Cape May. Imagine that. He built it in 1849. With his lumber, the house was built, the church there was built, and next door was the Banneker House, which was a hotel for visiting free Africans, and it was likely built by him. He was on the board of directors. He was a tremendous philanthropist. If you go to Columbia on 5th Street, Mount Zion AME Church was a gift from Stephen Smith. Next door is the dilapidated building. That was the 5th Street Colored School. Even though segregation in education was outlawed in Pennsylvania in 1883, that school existed until 1928. In Chester County, segregated schools lasted even longer. And I think this is my last one. William Goodrich. William Goodrich, same story, he's from Maryland, is able to come to Pennsylvania. He learns barbering in Marietta and then moves to York, where he becomes a sort of a fixture. He built a house on York Square that at one time was the tallest building in York. And that, of course, caused some jealousies. He was involved in the lumbering business also. He owned 13 cars. And at some point, he and Whipper and Smith are partners, and he also sends freedom seekers to Philadelphia. I hate to think of it, 20 years ago, Randy and I developed the information so that house on Philadelphia Street in York was on the network to freedom. And it's wonderful. If you get a chance, go over and see it. Well, that's the end of my little story. Thank you.
Well, two facts I want to share with you. In Barbara's slide, you saw the Fashawn family from Pittsburgh. They were tailors, wig makers, and plasticians, it was called. They made plastic noses and eye parts. So when people got to Pittsburgh, they would go to John Vachon, and he would completely change their appearance, so that they could set out. The Underground Railroad became above ground railroad as people hid in plain sight through that. So we're not always looking for tunnels. We're not always looking for water pipes or hidden things under the floor. The incredible, ingenious way that freedom seekers solved the first foundation, which was to seek their own freedom. Frederick Douglass escapes in freedom dressed as an African troubadour, a stevedore. He dresses like a guy loading freight, and he escapes in broad daylight. So the method of movement along the railroad changed depending upon the situation of the times. And we've spent, since I met Randy Harris in 2005, we've spent a great deal of time separating mythologies about addicts from facts about the railroad. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania owes a great deal to Randy Harris because of those 60 plus applications that were accepted in the Network to Freedom. I think Randy wrote about 2/3 of them. So 1/3. Well, modesty, 1/3. And so I'd love to bring Randy Harris to the podium now to share some of the many, many incredible stories he has about life along the Underground Railroad. We're trying to make a whole body out of this.
The story goes, he knocked me down and I just decomposed here right as I was on my way here tonight.
We were arguing about a dinner party between Thaddeus Stevens and James Buchanan.
Got into fisticuffs, seriously there. No, not at all. So thank you all for coming. It's great to be here with you. This is going to be a kind of a monumental thing. This is going to be the shortest Underground Railroad presentation I've ever done in order that we can get all of our voices here together and within the confines of the time that we have allotted. So where are we? We're here back in Goodrich land with Whipper and Smith. And I hope am I left or right? Okay, here we go. Okay, there I am. So Columbia, Lancaster, Chester County, on to Philadelphia from here. So it's thank you, Leroy, for focusing in on Columbia and the importance of that particular community. We're going to take a little more of a deep dive into the landscape there to indicate how that was a terminus that allowed people to move more freely than ever before to get to Philadelphia, which was the point of freedom, where a launch point you could get to the north from there much easier than almost anywhere else. You see the tracks coming from the right? They came across that long wooden covered bridge, the longest covered bridge in the world. And Front Street, which is what you're looking at there, was actually not a street, it was the railroad line. And so all of those properties along there, of which there were probably 16, hotels, houses, taverns, they were the safe houses of the Underground Railroad. So when you came across that bridge, you were kind of told, go into almost any one of those places and someone will be there to help you. It was a remarkable epicenter of this community activity that really supported what Leroy talked about. There's 20 years prior to this two waves of African Americans who established that support system that existed there. But in the context of that riverfront area of Columbia, look at the opportunities for transportation, of movement of people. I sometimes call the Underground Railroad a movement, a social political movement about movement of people from one place to another, from the horrors of slavery into a much more opportunistic opportunity for freedom. But we see this all started with the Wright family, lower right, lower center. 1730s, the ferry across the river would have been the launch point, a gateway to the west, the first connected to the Lancaster and Philadelphia Turnpike, the first turnpike in the country where you had an opportunity to travel all year long for a toll from Philadelphia to Lancaster, this very important inland city. But then when you got to the river, you needed a way to get across. So that was the opportunistic and very ingenious Wright family, the early settlers there, who moved that in that direction. Within a couple of years after that, well, maybe more than a couple of years after that, you had the establishment of the Jonathan and Susan Mifflin House, relatives of the Wrights, establishing in York County a safe house of the Underground Railroad going back that far. They would shepherd people between the two places by a black man named Robert Loney, who was their agent, who would shepherd people over when slave catchers were all over that 1812, 1814 bridge, the first bridge that crossed the Susquehanna River, right below the Mifflin House in York County. So you came across the Columbia, and then eventually the state, as part of this main line of public works, began to invest in canals, railroads, and inclined planes. And the first iteration of that is the Pennsylvania Canal that started at Columbia and went north from there to Harrisburg, as Barbara talked about earlier. So that was in the works, but then there was supposed to be a canal from Philadelphia to Columbia, but they realized the limestone deposit was never going to make it profitable, able to dig a trench and a tunnel or a canal system. So they developed the railroad, the early primitive railroad. That became, by 1834, the second operating railroad in the country, regular operations of freight and passengers between Philadelphia through Lancaster City and then ending terminus in Columbia, where you then offloaded into the canals. Eventually, the new bridge was built. You see the 1832 bridge. By 1840, they put a train line across that connected to York City. And that's where the Goodrich House, or the Goodrich family, came into that transportation network. 1840 as well, you went from 45 miles to Havre de Grace, Maryland. We know that system was used to transport people. African Americans could get out of Maryland and come north, either by working on the canal boats or by secreting on the canal boats. So all of these transportation networks all work together in the Columbia-Wrightsville area to create this epicenter of this support that we know that eventually became known as the Underground Railroad collectively. And so we know so much about this because of Samuel Evans. Dr. Hopkins pointed out, this man was a radical abolitionist, a Civil War veteran, a magistrate in Columbia, and the chronicler of all of this thing through some early newspaper articles. So 1780, the spring of 1780 is a very important period of time because that's when the 15th Amendment was passed. Black men could get the right to vote after having achieved full citizenships for all people through the 14th Amendment a few years earlier. But the enfranchisement of the voting rights to black men seemed to be a threshold, a tipping point so-called, so that people now realized that what they were involved in, this illegal activity of anti-slavery, Underground Railroad activity, was now something to be proud of, something to elevate the stories of themselves and their families 2 generations or more before this happened in this region. And Evans was out there writing these stories, these recollections of the people who were involved in this activity. And it's just remarkable stories when you delve into what he wrote about. And mostly all of the national narratives emanate from his chronicling of these episodes in the newspapers of Lancaster City and Lancaster County. So back to Dr. Hopkins, showed you this. We're not repeating this. We're intentionally showing you this very important thing that Evans wrote. To understand the false end boxcars that shipped lots of people, we don't know how many, we don't know. We do know that it started in the late 1830s and went probably to 1855. That's the last time we hear a reference in the narratives that there was the use of this railroad leading right up to the advent of the Civil War. So it could have been hundreds, could have been who knows how many people, but there's no train cars left to examine, unfortunately, but this is what they did. But what's really interesting is narrative that Evans wrote said that they went to the inclined planes at Philadelphia where they got off the train cars at Fairmount Park, which John Sigmund is going to tell you about. Then they went around Philadelphia to New Bedford. So New Bedford is what? New Bedford, Massachusetts. It's the place where Frederick Douglass ended up seeking his freedom when he escaped the eastern shore of Maryland. It became a hotbed, a really formidable place where anti-slavery activity occurred, and it formed this very strong network in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Now, this is a period of time, somehow, people didn't want to go to Philadelphia because it was dangerous, because the late 1830s was the rise of nativism. More black people coming into Philadelphia were overwhelming the social and labor networks there. Longer established white people were getting very nervous about the ascendancy of a black community competing for jobs and opportunities there in Philadelphia. So there was resistance. So there was not, at that time, favorable to go into Philadelphia. So this indicates that they went around Philadelphia. So guess who appears on the scene around this same time? Thaddeus Stevens, as a state legislator, off and on, back and forth in the 1830s, he is an anti-Mason. He's supporting Governor Joseph Rittner in his reelection to the governorship of Pennsylvania. And he becomes a canal commissioner, a very powerful position as a state legislator who controls where the rights of way are going, who's contracted to build the different parts of the canals and who's working on them. Patronage was flourishing in this whole time period, and Thaddeus Stevens was the guy controlling a lot of this activity. And a partner of his from his time in Gettysburg, McPherson, not the Edward McPherson who became the clerk in the House of Representatives, but his son became the toll taker for 3 years in the Columbia Yards. So he was the guy, according to Brad Hoke's book, Thaddeus Stevens, The Making of an Abolitionist in Gettysburg. It's a really great book. You should pick it up sometime. This guy, McPherson, was the guy who was regulating who was coming and going on those trains for 3 critical years after the trains started moving and up until we know that Smith and Whipper were moving people in these train cars. So he would have been able to determine who could get on, who could get off, who could look the other way, so that there wouldn't be the kind of an exposition or an exposure to these people involved in this activity. And this was a guy that Stevens put in place in that time period. So, and Stevens was campaigning for Rittner's reelection, promising all kinds of opportunities for anything having to do along with the main line of public works, jobs, opportunities, bridge over the canal so you could get conveniently to your family's house on the other side. He was promising the moon, the part of that reelection effort, but guess what? Didn't happen. Rittner was not reelected. A Democrat got in and upset the entire apple cart at that particular time, late 30s, early 40s. So back here to Columbia, that same street we were talking about before. I mean, this is just quite amazing. This is amazing that there's no image up there. Okay, try that again. Click it again. There we go. Oh, thank you. Barbara does some great animation with these little things right there. So that same row is what you're looking at right there. And this is an 1850 map. So Stevens comes from Gettysburg, Adams County, leaves that position there, comes to Lancaster County, and he's now investing in and becoming a lawyer in Lancaster City, Lancaster County. He buys a piece of property right next to Stephen Smith. You see Stephen Smith. You see Black's Hotel. That shows up in the narrative as a main area where people could go and get support, food, shelter, but most importantly, directions to the next safe house of the Underground Railroad beyond Columbia, heading east to Philadelphia. So Stevens buys an investment property there. He didn't live there, but why, of course, would he buy a property in 1842, 43, if not for wanting to support this network of freedom-seeking activity going on? And you see William Whipper's lumberyard right there across the railroad tracks in the lower right. Again, this is an 1850 map that shows the owners of these properties. So where are we now? This is my last slide. It's the quickest slideshow I've ever done. I've told you this. By 1834, the locomotive itself is called the Lancaster, okay? It's hauling train passage back and forth, and it's the same corridor that we travel from the Amtrak line from Lancaster to Philadelphia. It's virtually the same corridor. It is now, through the research of Leroy, myself, and others, we submitted that information to the National Park Service, and they recognized that corridor, that right-of-way, as a pathway of the Underground Railroad. So what I'd like you folks to do, next time you take the train back and forth to Philadelphia, ask a conductor if he knows this story. I will almost guarantee you that he or she doesn't know this story. And my friend Lenwood and I have been trying to break the ice there, that we should have a training session for these conductors so that they could tell this story. I mean, you can think about that. I mean, I think a lot of people would be interested in that. Would you? I would. So there you go. Thank you very much.
Let's leave this just before we move the slide, I want you to look down at the bottom right-hand side of the screen is the logo of the National Park Service's Network to Freedom, the Northern Star logo. And it's a very, very, very powerful image, but not all people were trying to get to Canada. In fact, Pennsylvania, with its Gradual Abolition Act, had a law originally that if you made it to Pennsylvania for 6 months and 1 day, then you were standing on free soil and you could be free. It caused George Washington to write a manual for his colleagues who owned enslaved people and brought them to Pennsylvania about how to rotate. Remember, Philadelphia was the capital. So old George wrote a cookbook on how to rotate your enslaved people out of the state. We were safe again here until 1850 with the Fugitive Slave Act passed, and those people who had been here from 1838 to 1850 and thought that this was home had to get up and leave again. So you see another migration out there. A migration in 1876 with the end of the Reconstruction Act, and in 1910 again. Barbara had that slide at the end with all the Pittsburghers there. I want to say when you made it to Pittsburgh, either on Route 30, the Lincoln Highway, or along the Pennsylvania Railroad, then you got on Route 79 and you started to Erie and to Niagara and to cross again. So we are at a junction function here about transportation. So many great stories Barbara could have told you about that third wall, which we call vigilance and resistance, the people who are not moving people, but stopping bounty hunters from recapturing freedom seekers. A bounty hunter got $5 for bringing a suspected freedom seeker to Baltimore, and $10 more if it was proven that that person was actually a self-emancipator. But you got $5 one way or the other dragging any Black person across the Mason-Dixon line to Baltimore. And so there was a long list of lawyers in major cities like Harrisburg and Lancaster and Philadelphia who were there much like civil rights lawyers to jettison to Baltimore and try to free. You had 72 hours to prove that a man or a woman was free before they were sold deeper into the South. And so the stories about how they got there and how are all captured in the William Stills books about the Underground Railroad. And John is going to bring us home to Philadelphia and talk about that role. But I share with you one illusion that you may have seen before. It is the picture of Henry Box Brown arriving at Philadelphia with the Philadelphia Abolitionist Society opening the crate and Henry Box Brown. How many of you have seen that picture before? Well, I draw your attention to two things. First is it's Frederick Douglass's face that is on the Henry Box Brown's body. Frederick Douglass was the most popular photographed and lithographed person. They didn't know what Henry Box Brown looked like. So that is actually Frederick Douglass's face. Go back and look at it again. The other thing, which I really do love, is Henry Box Brown is getting out of that box in full evening dinner clothes. Now, that boy knew how to travel, you know. He really knew how to travel, you know. In a crate, on a carriage, on a train, you know, he made it to Philadelphia and to William Stills, ready for dinner. John?
All right, thank you. That's I guess he was ready for Philadelphia society. One point of clarity for Randy's talk, though. The Philadelphia Plains, not the Philadelphia International Airport. I just want to clarify that was not in use at the time. So I'm very honored. I work for the Fairmount Park Conservancy, which is here. Oh, I guess I'll do a little click through. There we go. We are the nonprofit organization that works in the parks along with our esteemed partners at Parks and Rec. So I'm the guy that does kayaking and salsa dancing and all sorts of activities. So it's kind of an amazing opportunity for me to be here with so many esteemed colleagues who have specialized in this topic. So I would not consider myself an expert, but I've had the privilege of bringing this topic to life through programming. So quick, if you would allow me, I'm going to divulge a quick story about myself. Not only do I work for the park, I live in the park. Where, you might ask? When I told my mom, she was worried for me, but I actually do live as a caretaker at a historic mansion. So if you know Fairmount Park, we have a lot of historic mansions that have been preserved. I live at Woodford Mansion, a 1756 mansion that's a National Historic Landmark. And I had the opportunity, so I talk a lot about 18th century history, talk a lot about the colonial history, don't feel quite as versed on this topic, though I've learned a lot through my colleagues and through some reading I've done. But anyway, I'm at Woodford Mansion, and our tour guide, Jerry Francis, who also was the president of the Lower Merion Historical Society. Jerry's not with us anymore, I'm sad to say, but Jerry was a dear friend. And Jerry and I would do little coffee talks. And at the coffee talk, I would raise a question, and then he would fill me in on all the answers. And I said, why is there an underground railroad museum at the Belmont Plateau? And then he said, oh, you need to do some more investigating into the very fascinating history of the Belmont Plateau. And then he explained the connection between the Philadelphia Columbia Railroad and the inclined plane, and then, of course, the metaphor. And then my mind was blown because I started spiraling back in my memory to fifth grade when our teacher was teaching us about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, and I'm imagining the Underground Railroad as a subway line. And I said something to that effect, and Packy McDonald pointed at me and said, "No, dummy, it wasn't really a train line." And then so here I was 30 years later, I wanted to call up Packy McDonald and say, actually, there was a train line. So that was sort of what got this started for me. So here we are. This is not the Belmont Plateau we know. This is the Belmont Plateau of yesteryear. And one actual point of clarity that I think is important to make is that at the time, this is not Fairmount Park yet. If you know Philadelphia and a little history of our park system, unlike Central Park that was cohesively designed, we were assembled bit by bit, patchwork by patchwork, starting with Lemon Hill Mansion property in 1844. It wasn't until 1869, after emancipation, that Fairmount Park purchased this parcel of land. So here we are, though, a view from 1875. I just wanted to share this in order to give you a sense of what it would have looked like for freedom seekers and for people at the time. You can actually see the Columbia Bridge there, and then in the far distance, you can see what's called the Connecting Railroad Bridge, very famously depicted in the background of a Thomas Eakins painting of a scholar. So here we are today. Most Philadelphians know this is an iconic spot for us. It's where our people meet. All sorts of activities happen there. I will not specify the activities, but all sorts of activities happen there. Of course, if you're a fan of 90s rap, might be the wrong crowd, I don't know. But if you're a fan of 90s rap, you might remember Will Smith, DJ Jazzy Jeff sang the song Summertime, and they talked about a place in Philly, which was I'm not going to rap it, don't worry, they'll cut the mic. But they talked about the Belmont Plateau as a place where everybody meets. But it is really, I just do want to make a note that it is a spot in terms of organizing programming. It's a spot that's familiar to a lot of Black Philadelphia. So I think that is important. It's a spot of great, there used to be a Greek picnic that met there for many years. It's a spot, it's a known entity, it's a familiar entity, it's a comfortable entity. So, and here it is in Google Maps. So just if you're not as familiar with Philadelphia, this is a quick little tutorial. So here's the Schuylkill River that cuts through our park. So we are Watershed Park. Sorry, I said that like a Philadelphian, a Watershed Park, with East Fairmount Park on the right. And then here we are in West Fairmount Park. So now let's jump back in time again. So here's what Randy and Barb were talking about, the inclined plane. Not exactly the Allegheny Mountains, but this is one of the high points of Philadelphia. And so it presented quite a challenge. As you can see from this 1835 map, they had to install the inclined plane in order to handle this hill. And if you do the math, which I will, the entire plane track was a 2-track inclined plane that ran 2,805 feet, lowering 1 foot and 15, right? Who's crunching the numbers, for a total descent of 187 feet. So again, not the Allegheny Mountains, but still presented quite a challenge. So this was a point where, again, was the moment that my tour guide friend kind of said, pay attention to the inclined plane, because this is really where this was a significant site where freedom seekers would disembark. Reason for that is you have the planes essentially coming to a stop, and these are mixed-use trains. This is carrying cargo and freedom seekers and regular passengers. They're all on this train together, and the train's going to come to a stop here as they hook it to a stationary steam engine, and a rope to pull the rail cars down the hill. So this would present an opportunity for people to disembark. And one thing, I'm sorry I don't have a laser pointer, but you can see the word Belmont is going. There we go. Thank you, Len. Len's got the old school laser pointer. The Belmont is there. That's the Belmont Mansion. So that's Belmont Mansion. And then if you go down the hill, you'll see Peter's Tavern marked. So these are both opportunities. And I think this actually makes a lot of sense, because if you look on at the schedule of the railroad, they will provide time for people to stop. They call it tarrying is the word, for 5 to 30-minute stops where they could have refreshments. So my theory is that if you're coming from Philadelphia, you're only making the stop like 15 minutes in. So you're going to stop at Peter's Tavern for a quick beer, right? But if you're coming the opposite direction, which these trains would be coming carrying freedom seekers, if you're coming from the west to the east, you've been on a bit of a journey since the last stop, so you would stop in the Belmont Mansion for a meal. So there was a restaurant at the Belmont Mansion. So this would provide opportunity for freedom seekers to make their escape into the woods and into the farmlands around there. So that's a quick backstory on all that. Here's this beautiful view of the inclined plane. This was the image that really started it all for me. When you have that one image that you just keep looking at over and over and over. This is an 1840 colored lithograph by John Caspar Wilde. That's view of the inclined plane near Philadelphia. You can see these two men standing, operating it. So it gives you a sense of what it looks like. But what Jerry told me is go to the Belmont Plateau, step into the woods, and you'll still see the indent in the landscape. And I followed his advice. And when I found that indent in the landscape, it was a mind-blowing thing. And it's something that we continue to point out on various hikes and various programs we do to connect people to the geography. All right, I'm going to try to jump fast here. So we put together this route. It was about three some miles, 8 stops. You can see every blue marker is a stop. And we did this. The reason, sort of our impetus for this was William Still's. So I kind of had another aha moment where I said, we really need to do an Underground Railroad event. I started reading up on William Still, and this is in April of 2021. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, October 7th, 2021 is going to be William Still's 200th birthday. So let's make this in honor of William Still. We don't know whether William Still actually spent much time in this particular spot. It was more in honor of him. So we one important thing we did is we hired a storyteller named Dion Patterson, who has her own. She's based in Delaware. She is a Black storyteller, goes by Conductor D, and she really brings the Underground Railroad experience to life through story and through immersive experiences. So Dion was on board. And we developed this route that would be accessible. So you can see the yellow line is the route, accessible for people of most abilities. I mean, it's certain portions were a little challenging. And we did create, in case people couldn't keep up or had to leave early, we created a walk guidebook that people could bring with them that explained the kind of the whole route. And it was, about $700 at Staples that I spent putting this together. But, and for a nonprofit, that's somewhat frowned upon. But a lot of people really appreciated the guidebook and said that was something they respected, that they appreciated having along the way. So our first stop was at the Philadelphia Columbia Railroad sleeper stones. We'll talk about those more. You can see the next stop that I'm not going to just quickly mention is the Simpson House, which is the oldest retirement community in the world, founded by Matthew Simpson, who contributed to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and spoke at Lincoln's funeral and was called the High Priest of Radical Republicans. Then we passed through a rail tunnel that is not from the Philadelphia Columbia Railroad or the Pennsylvania Railroad. It's actually from the Fairmount Park trolley system, which was a recreational trolley. But that doesn't actually matter. And we mention it, but it's more of an evocative experience. And people were led in song there. So it's not necessarily, as far as I was concerned, it didn't actually matter. We did explain that difference. There's the inclined plane as our next stop. So that's in the woods. Then we work our way down to the Columbia Bridge. And then to Bolson Cottage. Whoops, I'm getting a little crazy here, but Bolson Cottage, and I'll talk a little more about that. And then we ended it at the Belmont Mansion. And then actually I should mention we started at Ridgeland Mansion because Belmont Mansion seems to always have weddings on Saturdays. So that's a whole nother, we all know that nonprofit game. So just, I know I'm short on time, but I just want to mention that this ended up going to a historic marker I didn't think would be such a powerful experience. Although, by the way, I don't know if you're able to read the text on this historic marker that was put in 2001, there is some important information omitted from this marker. Does anybody notice what it is? Sorry, hard to read. So it's talking about the Philadelphia Columbia Railroad. There's no mention of its connection to the Underground Railroad because in 2001, I guess we weren't quite there, or I know many people next to me were there, but so that's something I'd love to see changed. But we did, what I think became powerful is on the ground, you can barely see it in the image, but there are some sleeper stones that have been unearthed. And our attendees, who were 85 to 90% African Americans, at this spot, it became a holy site, is the best I can say. People had tears in their eyes. People lined up. A few people initiated song. And people walked in a single file between these sleeper stones and paused, took photographs. People got down on their knees and touched the stones because it was a tangible connection. And that's so, Len was saying the invisible, but also this was one of those rare moments where you actually have the visible. Bolson Cottage was another powerful moment because we hired she works at the Belmont Mansion and gives tours there. Bolson Cottage is the oldest building in Fairmount Park, built in 1684. Again, 1684. You don't get a lot of park infrastructure that old. And it was, had various uses through the years. But as you see from this postcard, it's been romanticized by, in white culture as Tom Moore's cottage, who was an Irish poet. Though very little evidence they actually lived there, but you'll see tons of postcards talking about Moore's College. But there was another woman that lived there named Cornelia Wells, who, as you can see here, moved in 1811 with her daughter Jane, and she ran a restaurant selling spruce beer and ginger cakes. And some of the people that sort of advised us in creating this thing said, this is important to talk about because we don't want the story to be all doom and gloom. We want there to be a story of Black entrepreneurship, of someone rising above. And so this was an important part for people. And then this was also the important aspect of having it be immersive. So we actually had ginger cakes. I went to some kind of weird specialty grocery store. And because I did not want to, we didn't do spruce beer. We passed on that because I've had spruce beer and it's not good. It's very astringent. But the ginger, I was very specific though. I said, I do not want to have those ginger snaps you see in the grocery stores, because those are very associated with Halloween, and we're not doing that. I said, my colleagues were like, how much time did you waste? I said, it's a long story. I drove to a supermarket out in Bucks County. So another amazing part that happened here is there actually is a horse stable that has a lot of black horse riders. It's called Belmont Stables. And they spoke, and in a beautiful, unscripted moment, I did mention to the leader who's there, I said, we're a little nervous about crossing under 76 because of the traffic and because of Philly drivers. And she said, we'll lead you with the horses. So they helped our group of 100 people cross lanes of traffic with horses. And that actually is something that we've integrated into the event. And it's a great connection. If you know anything, if you know the movie Concrete Cowboy, there's this whole tradition of black horsemanship in Philadelphia. So it was they were like the cavalry coming to our rescue. So that was great. And then we ended it again at Belmont Mansion, built in 1742, William Peters, but it was his son, Richard Peters, who was very significant, one of the early non-Quaker members of the abolition movement. And it's the current site of the Underground Railroad Museum. You can see it in the background there. So this was, and that again, is the guide from Belmont Mansion giving a talk to our group. So yeah, I would just kind of in conclusion, and you can see, by the way, you see those the blue gear, that is a group called Girl Trek. And that is a black outdoor group that's around the country. And they partner with us on a lot of park programs in the park. Another program we have in partnership with the Department of Health is called We Walk, which is all about getting people out to their community neighborhood park and having walking groups, feeling safe, walking together. Of course, it's a lot more than a walk. Their motto is it's a walk in the park, but it actually should be, it's more than just a walk in the park. There's a lot of camaraderie that happens there. And I would say their membership is roughly 90% African-American women. So having them as, I would just to conclude, I think some of the things that really made this succeed, every year we had over 100 attendees, which is a lot for a trail walk. The mountain bikers were a little thrown off. But some keys for us is that part of the planning, bringing in Dion Patterson as a storyteller, bringing in Girl Trek and We Walk to be participating in the planning. Underground Railroad Museum helped us. Also, we work, and I'm very happy to say we have some members here of the Black Docents Collective in Philadelphia. Joel and Michael, if you want to raise your hand there in the back there. So they drove here. I kept it more historically accurate and took the train, but but it was, so I think part of the bringing black folks into the planning, I think, was really important. And then, of course, having black folks at the center of, as storytellers. We had a gentleman portraying William Still, again, those horse riders, and we even had catering from 2 different black-owned businesses. So I think that was really important. And then, of course, having the attendees coming from the community was really important. So this is a huge success. We've done it. The photograph on the left is actually, we did it for a school in Strawberry Mansion called Community Partnership School. And they are assigning a sort of a pledge to William Still Pledge. And also you can see we have a copy of the Underground Railroad book, not the original 1872. It's a 1970s Ebony Classics off of eBay, but still very nice reproduction. So it was a really, I think what really made this experience special is that it was multi-sensory. It wasn't, to me, telling the story of the Underground Railroad shouldn't be about places and things, but it really should be about people. And it should also really bring people into what are the senses and really humanize the experience. And so that's really, having Dion as our storyteller, who really activated it as an immersive experience and really brought a feeling of putting people in the place. We even stopped at one point and ate pawpaws because we have some pawpaw trees in the park. And then she created these little Freedom Seeker bags that she handed out to every guest that had kernels of corn and potatoes. and some other objects. So really trying to activate all the five senses and make it an immersive experience, I think, was really important to making this a successful event. And in conclusion, I invite all of you to join us on October 7th, which will be William Still's actual birthday. So we should have cake. I just realized, add that to the list. October 7th, we will be doing this event again in Fairmount Park. So visit our website, myphillypark.org, for more info. And that's it from me.
John is the reason why I'm going to be able to sit down eventually, because there is a new set of young, dynamic contextualizers and animateurs growing, who are taking the sites and the conservation, preservation, and restoration movements of people like Randy and Dr. Hopkins, or Barbara's on both sides. She's got one foot on both sides. And bringing a sense of spirit and animation and immersion experience. One of our challenges that we found across the last 10 to 15 years is that we take people to places and we say something really important happened here, but it's not here anymore, or we tell them about the importance of driving the 75 miles to read a sign, and so what we're trying to do is to adapt the sense of the experience. The Underground Railroad and the quest of freedom is about people making dynamic transformations. And each time that you can place a transformer at that site, then it's important. But what about if there's no site there? Well, then it's about the stories of those people. And each of you can become an agent of the Underground Railroad by telling the guests who visit your house all the time. 56% of visitors to Lancaster's stay in hotels. The other 44% stay on your sofa, on your fold out, on your air mattress. So you can turn your kitchen table into a concierge desk, and you can turn your fireside chat. Sites across, everybody loves acronyms. So I'll give you two. We are an FLA. What does it stand for? Fairly Loose Alliance. We are a fairly loose alliance of custodians who are trying to connect the dots, they're trying to keep the importance of the history alive. The evidence of the need for our work is the fact that while we sit here, the 14th Amendment, the centerpiece of Thaddeus's work, is being discussed 4 different ways on the news tonight. It's being discussed in relationship to a woman's right of her own body. It's being discussed on an immigrant's right to have their newborn child be a citizen. It's being discussed on same-sex partners being able to love each other. And it's being discussed about whether or not a fugitive president has the right to run again. So the relevance, this is not sepia tone history. This is the blueprint for the evening news. And so we need to deputize you to work with us, and for your part in the history. But before I do that, I've asked each of my colleagues, friends, and guests to respond, and you can from I think your voices will carry. What's next? From your piece of the action, from your real estate, from the real estate of your impact and your legacy, what's next, Barb? Advance the slide. What's next is advance the slide. Oh, but I'm going the wrong way. Up. You all thought I was kidding about my grandchildren there. be a giver.
I will.
So,
There we go. So my next step is I've been working with several state legislators. Initially, we had a committee formed, of which all of us are on. And one of our goals was to get September permanently designated in Pennsylvania as Underground Railroad Month. It already has in the states of Ohio and Maryland, and we figure that Pennsylvania certainly has a right to have that as well. We are also working with legislators because many years ago, as Lenwood can tell you, there was activity at the state level through the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission to recognize Underground Railroad activity in Pennsylvania. Of course, with changing legislators, that got cut. So we would like to bring that back. So at some point in time, depending on how this works with what we're doing right at the state level now, we may be reaching out to you to ask you to please contact your local legislature and say, this is important for the history of Pennsylvania, and I want you to endorse activities connected to the Underground Railroad. So that's my next steps.
Doctor, what is your next step?
Well, there are a couple of things that are going on. One is you'll see the image. In Columbia, the old bridge is going to be marked, and there's going to be a marker about William Whipper. But I want you to look in your attics and in your basements and see if you have anything that's relevant to Black history. Today, I found out that someone found a journal that belonged to William Whipper and Stephen Smith, and is going to give it to the society. The history is there. It's just a matter of collecting it. And what I'm hoping, I'm the past president of the African American Historical Society of South Central Pennsylvania. Kathleen Anderson, sitting there, is the vice president now. And I'm hoping that our organization gets involved with Lancaster History to really do a biography of Stephen Smith and William Whipper. There are basic information that is lacking. We don't know who their parents are. We have some idea who they were, but about their business. Where did they do business? You saw the picture, the image of the letter that went to William Still from William Whipper. He wrote that from New Brunswick, New Jersey. What was he doing in New Brunswick? We don't know. That's part of what I want to see happen.
Randy, your next step?
Thanks. Actually, Leroy touched on this project going on in Columbia these days. The riverfront park that's there now, Columbia Crossing Visitor Center, which is a wonderful riverfront area where people can now connect to that riverfront. Well, north of the 462 bridge is a 10-acre, 12-acre strip purchased by the borough of Columbia, and it's going to commemorate these bridge piers and the canal ruins that are in the woods behind it. So these stories will be told through trails and historical markers over the next several years. So these stories will be animated, a favorite Lenwood Sloan term, so that we can all go there and understand and appreciate what happened there as this place like a touchstone of what actually happened. So that's
great.
One more? Oh yeah, you can see the ruins of the canal there. That's Chris Vera from the Columbia Historic Preservation Society, a strong advocate for history in Columbia. And so these will be now, they're virtually inaccessible, a lot of poison ivy and a lot of overgrowth, but they will be opened up. That is north of the Route 462 bridge, the Veterans Memorial Bridge, maybe, I don't know, half a mile north of there, but that'll all be opened up for public access in that area. Oh, the Susquehanna Heritage Region, the York and Lancaster County organization that's promoting heritage in that area is involved in this activity, and it's a part of a coalition building that we're talking about that'll bring these stories alive.
And John, your next step?
Sure, that's yours.
Oh,
that's your call, Lenwood.
My next step. My next step is working with, Sondheim has that lovely quote, "The art of making art is putting it together." And a coalition of people are working in the art of collaboration to bring the Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith Center for Democracy into being. Not a museum, not a historic house, but a center where all roads lead to the dialogue table for freedom and democracy. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments were passed within the lifetime of Stevens. It took 50 years to pass the 19th Amendment. Those 50 years are called Jim Crow. And so we are trying to reconstruct the notion of safe houses. And the Stevens and Smith Center for Democracy will be a safe house where we can come together, check our weapons at the door, and have true dialogue about democracy. So that's my next step. John.
My next step is to continue. The next generation are visual learners, for better or for worse, because of things like TikTok. And so I think in order to connect with the next generation, we have to bring these things to life. So I just want to share this video where we sang a song called "Oh Freedom in This Tunnel." Again, this tunnel was not actually connected to the Underground Railroad, but it didn't matter. It was about this experience. And Dion Patterson, Dr. D, shared this to her social media. So
how do just click it?
There it is.
So that common ground experience is really important. We're going to take some questions, but I promised you 2 acronyms. So this next acronym is called WOMBATS. That's you, okay? WOMBAT stands for Word of Mouth, Brand Ambassadors and Transmitters. Word of mouth, brand ambassadors and transmitters. So what does the S stand for? Society, because we all like to belong to leagues or guilds. So if you will raise your hand, left or right, and promise that you will tell somebody the story that you heard tonight, any part that you remember, but I need you to act on it. I need you to act on it, because each of you will become a word of mouth, brand ambassador and transmitter. That's how the Underground Railroad communicated before Morse code, before all the other devices, that we need you to take this word to your guests at your dinner table. Question.